Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning once again. Good morning once again. We are privileged to be joined by our guest of honor, which is our cue to get started with our short agenda this morning. You are all most welcome. We welcome you once again. In the packet, it's before you, you'll find a very short agenda. We have already ticked off the first item on the agenda, which is arrival. You have arrived and you're here. So you're most welcome. As you are arriving, who are being invited to a breakfast, which will be still ongoing. The next item on the agenda will be welcome remarks. And then we'll have a highlight presentation. We'll have a panel discussion. We'll have remarks from the head of LP. And then we'll go for the gist of why we are here, the official launch. And we'll continue even after the official launch. There is much more that is prepared for you. So we'll be continuing through our interactions and through the breakfast before we depart. So though we have started quite where our time to run, we'll strive to finish by 10. And we know that that is going to be a reality. The first item that we want to adopt before we go to the next thing is that since our breakfast was already prayed for when it was prepared, now we want to pray for our event this morning. It is a room filled with people very near God. I see my sister Rebecca. I see my sister Rebecca somewhere. I know you're having breakfast. In our culture, you don't lift people who are eating. But now that our guest of honor is here, I'm going to ask Brenda to come and move this microphone to you so that you give us a short opening prayer to bless our event. Rebecca, it's a pleasure to see you, and would you kindly give us a short opening prayer? Rebecca is right there. So I hope our mouths can humble themselves as we are praying.
Thank you, Councillor Stone. Since you've decided to defy culture, I'll go along. I'll pause on my breakfast. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. May we humble ourselves for our word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the gift of life this morning. We thank you for the journey mercies. We thank you that we have arrived here well and safe. We place this morning and this event into your hands. We ask that you will guide us, that you will guide all our deliberations, that we shall all learn for the good of our country, for the good of our careers, for the good of the East African region, Africa at large, and for the greater glory of your name. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen, amen, amen. So as we continue with having our breakfast, I will go to the second item on the agenda, and those are welcoming remarks. I am privileged to be delivering these remarks. Our dear guest of honor, honorable dignitaries, ladies and gentlemen, it's a good morning, and allow me to say good morning. My name is Laston Gulume. I'm privileged to serve as a practice director at ALP Advocates. We are honored to host you this morning to this 2022 to 23 annual ESC Common Market CSG scan in Kampala, Uganda. And as ALP, part of the bigger family of the Africa law practice. Ladies and gentlemen, our ethos as a practice is clearly expressed in our vision as an African to be a go-to firm, providing solutions that spur an African renaissance for our clients and community. So this annual 2022 to 23 ESC Common Market CSG scan is one of our products towards working that vision as ALP East Africa. ALP East Africa, as Africa Law Practice, is an integrated law firm, which is the first of its kind in as far as integrating professional services and legal services. Our practice currently has presence in 4 East African Community Partner States. That is Uganda, here, in Kenya, Nairobi, in Dar es Salaam, in Tanzania, and Juba, South Sudan. ALP East Africa has regional affiliation with ALP Nigeria and Company, and together we host an ALP trade portal. Our previous engagements, in line with this trade portal as the ALP brand, combining ALP East Africa and ALP Nigeria, have been a series of town hall webinars on the African Continental Free Trade Area in 2021 and 2022. These webinars were on issues of trade in services, competition, among others, on the continental-wide trading bloc. The key attribute of ALP East Africa, which is hosting you this morning, ladies and gentlemen, as a cross-border law firm to position trade integration in East Africa and Africa as a whole, has been a major facet and is a major facet of our work on this common market CHG scan. And this has been in several ways. I'll just highlight 4 of those ways. Firstly, we have leveraged our position as a cross-border law firm to position trade integration in East Africa and Africa as a whole in our legal and consulting work and consulting practice. Secondly, the CHG scan, which we are going to be launching this morning, speaks to our passion for ESC, for East African Community Trade Integration, even as we carry out a legal practice integration experiment as a law firm, having offices in the different jurisdictions of the East African states. We believe in the East African trade integration very, very strongly, and the principles that shape and underpin this integration. Ladies and gentlemen, to that end, ALP East Africa has been involved in a number of initiatives towards realizing this reality, and we are still involved in these initiatives. I'll only still highlight just 4 of those initiatives. The first is that we are doing, and we still do, litigation before the East African Court of Justice, which is the regional court of the integration, in matters that speak to the rights and freedoms that the court has seen as critical to trade, such as the right to property as an essential to private sector-driven investment. We are privileged that we have private actors in this room this morning who are doing business across borders, and we think that that is a very good facet. The other initiative that we have been and are still engaged in is our participation in trade-themed conferences and seminars. For example, resolution of trade and custom-related disputes, and our participation has extended to trainings that are intended to further the understanding, to further the grasping of the concept and benefits of integration. Providing legal and consulting advisory services has been one of our initiatives, more so on trade-related agreements, and the stakeholder engagements with government agencies and private sector players on trade-related matters. Now, specifically on the scan, the third aspect that has enabled us walk this far and where we want to go is that the scan is one of our efforts on the partner states' compliance with their commitments towards the free movement of capital, services, and goods. Our expectation is that the scan will shine light on the capital, services, and goods commitments under the East African customs, under the East African Common Market Protocol, as well as provide partner states such as Uganda, where we are launching this scan today, this morning, and more importantly, as the private sector actors, as a food for thought on deepening or thinking about some of the shortfalls that have fallen the trade integration. Fourthly and lastly on this scan, our presence in the 4 East African community partner states has enabled each of our country teams to track regulatory measures that inform the scan that we are going to be launching this morning, ladies and gentlemen. And although we do not yet have physical presence in the East African countries such as Rwanda, Burundi, or the Democratic Republic of the Congo, we are already exploring, establishing, and cultivating important relationships in those jurisdictions. This scan was led by our ALP knowledge team, the product that we are going to be launching this morning, and this team was headed by our Dr. Henry Honoria, with input from our ALP country offices. Friends, all this has been possible under the leadership of our team leader, Senior Counsel Francis Gimara. At ALP East Africa, we plan to issue this CSG scan as an annual product, and our next CSG scan will be covering the period of April 2023 into March 2024. And we plan to include Burundi as one of the ESC partner states. Well, along the way or down the road, we shall also include the Democratic Republic of the Congo in the subsequent scans. We are deeply grateful, ladies and gentlemen, that you have honored our invitation to attend this Uganda country launch of the 2022 to 23 CSG scan. We expect no greater advocates for the ESC trade integration agenda than yourselves, ladies and gentlemen, because you're involved in trade, you're involved in the investment spaces, and you're engaged in businesses, manufacturing, innovation, in services and delivery of goods, as well as think tanks, among other spaces that are relevant towards this cause. Your attendance this morning is the most important reason as to why we are here, because it creates a platform for discourse and engagement on integration issues which are at the heart of our practice as ALP. The CSG scan, ladies and gentlemen, has largely been a private initiative by ALP East Africa, which in itself, of course, is a costly endeavor. But we assure and hope that the issues that are raised from this scan will engage our collective minds towards realizing the benefits of regional integration. At ALP East Africa, we are open to collaboration and synergies on working on the annual regulatory scans. So please expect us to reach out to you even after this launch, because we are interested in those synergies and collaborations. We believe and hope that the short time we are going to spend in this place this morning is going to be worthwhile your time. Friends, ladies and gentlemen, asante sana. Allow me to take this privilege and opportunity to invite Dr. Henry Honoria, who is going to be giving us highlights on the ESC partner states' compliance with capital, goods, and services commitments under the Common Market Protocol in 2022 to 2023. Dr. Henry Honoria is our knowledge partner, and he has been engaged in these initiatives. He has been a consultant on many consultancies, and we believe that we are going to be receiving very powerful knowledge this morning. Doctor, you're most welcome, sir.
Thanks, Laston. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this space, and be comfortable, enjoy your breakfast. No protocol set out, I would assume that there's a protocol somewhere, and so it's observed. All right, so I hoping that I don't spend too much time going through this document. So actually, as you can see, you'll eventually be given a copy of it. We're likely to have it posted by the end of the day. But I just wanted to give highlights of the scan on capital, free movement of capital services and goods under the Common Market Protocol. And I'm going to look at only Uganda. We did 5 partner states, as you can see there. What were we looking at? The regulatory measures adopted by the partner states in respect of their commitments under the 2009 protocol and capital services and goods. That's why it's CSG. The countries we looked at were Kenya, Rwanda, South Sudan, Tanzania, and Uganda. And what were we looking at? For this initial scan, we were largely concentrating on the regulatory measures. That means we're looking at the laws, that's legislation, acts. I think most of us who are in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda used the word acts. In Rwanda, they use the word laws. But also we had regulations, as well as significant number of measures, administrative measures in terms of guidelines, notices, and orders. As the last one pointed out, the period is January to December 2022, but we opted to stretch it to January to March 2023, because we discovered so many partner states, I don't know whether it's a habit, they tend to dump a huge chunk of legislation at the very tail end of the year. And sometimes you cite them all at the beginning of the year. I know, honorable ministers, the regulations on beneficial ownership also dropped in January. So that's why we are doing that we need a period where we can then also look at what has come out at the tail end. Now, these are the statistics, just quick statistical overview. I'm probably seen on the flyer that in Uganda we had 6 acts. The bulk of these were the amendments to the companies, the establishment laws, companies, partnerships, cooperatives, and trusts, as well as a few other acts, including the Mining Act. And then the number of bills which are still pending. There's a bill on local content which has been pending since April last year. I'm told it's back in Parliament, but we also had interesting bills at the beginning of this year. There was 26 regulations ranging all the way from the capital markets to the Uganda National Bureau of Standards, and then a number of administrative notices. Again, this came out from the standards body. But as you can see, the partner states were not quiet on the regulatory side of things. Every country tried as much as possible to enact legislation. Now, these are legislation specific to and relevant to the capital market, to the commitments under the Common Market Protocol. So this is not all that they legislated in there. I don't think that's what they did. So these are just some examples of the legislation. You'll find them at the tail end of the scan once eventually you get it. It includes tax-related regulations, the number of professional regulations for advocates. As you can see, National Bureau has several instruments there. And then you have capital markets, the tail end. As you can see, they were all issued in December. There were a number of financial institutions, the CRB regulations that were issued from the central bank. This is not all. As you can see, there's other measures that were issued by other regulators, including the Uganda Free Zones Authority. It issued at least a number of declarations of free zones. The bills, these are the ones you can see, the National Local Content Bill, a competition bill, and then the 2 tax bills that were issued at the tail end of our period of 30th March 2023. Now, these are the key findings in regards to Uganda. And there are 3, as I said, there are 3 freedoms we targeted, but I'm sure all of you will know about the Common Market Protocol. They're a bit more than that. There are actually 6 freedoms. But we have felt that these 3, free movement of capital, free movement of services, and free movement of goods, are actually the critical ones. Not to say that the other ones are not important, but too often when you move capital, the likelihood that you might have free movement of residence and establishment, that people might have to move to set up in another ESC partner state, and therefore you have the right to establishment and the right to free movement. And that means you can even move labor. So that's why we thought that let's concentrate on these which are critical drivers of economies. The rest are people moving and establishing themselves. Now, under Article 24 of the Common Market Protocol, the partner states are committed to elimination of restrictions on free movement of capital. Now, all the partner states, especially Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and Tanzania, actually endeavored to leverage measures, regulatory measures in capital and financial markets as a means of encouraging foreign and probably intra-regional investment. They introduced new and innovative capital and money market products. In Uganda, I think the Capital Markets Authority introduced, if we can go back to, seems to have, anyway, they introduced a security instrument at the tail end of December, which had 3 new instruments: commercial paper, well, they introduced commercial paper, which is intended to be address what they call short-term debt instruments. If you're like a business person and you want quick money to deal with payroll, settle suppliers and all that, you issue commercial paper. It's not a new concept. It actually dates back to New York. Just surprised that Uganda probably figured out that we need commercial paper as an instrument. But as they say, sometimes it's better to do something. It's never too late. Because I know Rwanda and Kenya issued these instruments way back, I think Rwanda in 2012. Then we also have what they call the depository receipts, which are supposed to facilitate trading in shares in foreign companies. The shares don't the country. And then finally, the exchange traded funds, which is a huge basket. You can trade in anything, including futures, commodities such as gold. Now, these are products that have been initiated by the Capital Markets Authority. The question is, how will this spur investments in Uganda and the common market? That's something that we need to look at. They say they came out at the end of the tail end of the. We have also strengthened accountability. The Capital Markets Authority has issued new financial regulations, accounting and financial regulations. So these replace the old regulations, SI 8444. They also declared a new collective investment authority. It's a Luxembourg investment firm and Standard Chartered Bank. So anybody who is interested in knowing what's the latest entrant in the CSIs, that's the fund that is available. Now, on the other side, there's a downside. I think everybody, this is something which I'm sure for those who are in the room are probably aware of. In March 30th, we introduced or gazetted the Income Tax Amendment Bill 2023, which sought to use tax-related measures to tax income or profits of collective investment schemes. And to me, and I think everybody else, this has had the potential of, I'm reading the word "had" because I'm told the bill has been withdrawn, the potential to act as a disincentive to savings and investment in such things like the unit trusts. Because most of the times the CSIs are where pools of small time savers save some money for a rainy day, and hopefully that they expect that the fund manager will invest in government securities and then other things, and then turn a profit, which then will be given to them. Now, the idea of taxing that income or that profit is somehow at odds, not just with the idea of encouraging investment, but realistically, it's actually at the odds with what's happening elsewhere. Now, I just wanted to show you what is happening in Rwanda as a comparison. This is what Rwanda has done. It issued a new income tax law, and this is the buffet from it. A whole bunch of exemptions. If you are investing in CSI and ESOPs, that's the employee savings or sharing, keep forgetting, ESOP, there's an income tax exemption. Now, the amendments are unique because they're sort of like closing down. This is only specific to Rwanda employees. They are doing, if you are doing trading in listed shares that are in the securities exchange in Rwanda, that's capital gains tax exempt. If you're investing in pension funds, SPVs, including asset-based securities, real estate investment trusts, and foreign trusts, that's corporate tax exempt. If you are like me and you who want to invest in listed securities in Rwanda, we have a reduced withholding tax at 5% instead of 15%. So it makes it attractive. If I wanted to invest, that's the place I would go. Income tax on shares is also withholding tax exempt. And now, I think this is what is new. They are making sure that anybody who wants to invest in deposits taking MFIs in Rwanda, the interest paid is withholding tax exempt. So these are all aimed, if you can look at that buffet, to encourage investment to go to Rwanda. So I think as a country, we need to rethink and maybe benchmark what's happening across other countries. I'm glad that the income tax amendment bill is withdrawn, but usually the problem is people might reintroduce it in one way or another. And I'm already told there was flight. People are thinking of moving investment elsewhere. Now, the other things that we may just point out in terms of free movement of capital, there are restrictions. But these are restrictions which, you see there in italics, the capital market protocol allows partner states to do, to restrict free movement of capital for reasons of prudential supervision, public policy, anti-money laundering, and financial sanctions agreed to by the partner states. Of course, there are requirements there that you notify the other partner states what you are doing. So the number of prudential oversight by regulators, Bank of Uganda, has been keen on, and that's why they have been issuing those financial institutions regulations, and they continue to do that today. On the CMA has issued a number of those, UNBS, beneficial ownership requirements. This has become a critical one. And it's not just to Uganda, it's everywhere. The amendments to various business establishment legislations at the end of 2022, companies, cooperatives, partnerships, and trusts. The number of anti-money laundering and countering terrorism financing measures, even regulations that have come out early this year. So this might sound like the impact on free movement of capital, but sometimes they say it's better to be prudent in terms of what money is coming in. Uganda remains stuck, blacklisted on the gray list. I think that we've been given a lease of life until September 2023. Before then, there might be sanctions against that. So we need to the ML anti-money laundering measures serious. I know Bank of Uganda has issued various administrative notices. Now, in terms of free movement of services, Article 16 requires partner states to guarantee free movement of services. Now, several partner states have sought to do so by using national legal frameworks, especially tax and related legislation to regulate services sectors. Free movement of services is cross-border supply, in the sense that someone in the state can supply services to Uganda and vice versa. So a number of partner states have had this effort to guarantee cross-border supply of digital and electronic services, at the same time leveraging the opportunities to tap into income tax revenues, especially income tax and VAT. There is called the digital marketplace supply provisions of finance and tax regulations. This is in our bills. So I'm trying to figure out what is, I know the Uganda Law Society issued their comments on the digital marketplace supply provisions. And so they require the reciprocal arrangements, bilateral treaties. Unfortunately, that was the wrong assumption. You can tax digital services based on purely law. You don't have to have an arrangement with the other party because it's just a service that is coming in, and all that you need to see, how do we tap into the revenue. Now, so we have these provisions in the bills, so it's waiting to see whether they will be kept. But I can point out that I would rather keep them because they are working well in Kenya and Tanzania. In one of the notable implications is that it defines what constitutes digital services in a manner that is similar to Kenya and Tanzania. In fact, even it has more broader examples. Kenya, as I said, Kenya and Tanzania have the digital marketplace regulations. First, they have the acts, but also regulations that were even beefed up in 2022 and 2023. But just to give you an example, in Tanzania, if you are supplying services, digital services to Tanzania, you don't even have to have a tax representative. All that you need to is go online to the Tanzania tax authorities website, register for VAT online, get a TIN number, supply services. There's a definition of how you supply services. If you are supplying it to a phone which is registered, a mobile SIM card which is registered in Tanzania, that is deemed as a form of supply, a proxy. And then the monthly period of tax. The tax period is monthly. So at the end of each month, you determine how much services you have delivered to Tanzania, determine what is the VAT, and remit the VAT online to an account designated by the customs, the Commissioner for Customs. So you don't even need to physically be there. So there are those opportunities that, so that's something I think Uganda is exploring under these bills. Now there's the parameters for taxable digital services by non-resident persons without business establishment in Uganda. Kenya has also the same approach, although Kenya kept the establishment provision. Now if you're established in Kenya, then you don't pay VAT because you are presumed to pay corporate tax because you are there. But in the absence, then it's VAT. The services that have been included under the bill, as I said, I'm waiting to see what was removed and whether they will bring back these very useful provisions. It includes immovable property, it includes radio, television, broadcasting, and transfer assignment of IP rights. This is interesting because it's not in the other experiences in Kenya and Tanzania. The rules for determining delivery of electronic services is to be prescribed by statutory instrument. This is understandable because this is an amendment to the proposed amendment to the Income Tax Act. Like Kenya and Tanzania, the details, the nitty-gritties are actually set out in VAT and income tax regulations. Payment of VAT is supposed to be in US dollars. This is interesting because in Tanzania, they say you can pay in Tanzanian shillings or another currency. So the emphasis is the local currency. Now, there are a number of other regulatory measures. These are on local content. As I mentioned, there's a national local content bill been pending since a year ago, and it addresses local content in the context of supply of services and goods. These are the notable implications. It reserves certain services and goods that are to be exclusively procured from Uganda. I don't know whether this is what we call boo-boo. But it ring fences services. And if you look at the list, it's largely the list that you'll find in Annex 5 of the Common Market Protocol. So it's interesting. Then priority is to be given to services from the other EAC partner states on the basis of, these are that there is local unavailability, that those services are not available locally in Uganda. They are provided by an EAC entity, that means an individual or a body, a corporate body, and it requires similar priority that is accorded to by the other East African partner states, essentially reciprocity, that the other partner states give reciprocity to Uganda, and that the services have a price competitiveness. Now, this looks good. I'm told the bill is back in Parliament because this might create problems in the sense that while we're doing this ring fencing, it could be permitted by local content, could even be principle of asymmetry. The other partner states might adopt a similar approach. And more importantly, the priority that we may give them they might look at it and say, okay, we're going also to do the same for the same services. We're going to list the same grounds, and if we can't find reciprocity, then we will not do the same. So it will become, we might end up finding ourselves in trade wars. That's the worry. But so I'm wondering I'm waiting to see what will eventually become of the bill in its final form. Finally, free movement of goods. Article 5, partner states are to be committed to eliminate tariff and non-tariff barriers and harmonizing and mutually recognizing certain trade standards. Now, the approaches to tariff barriers is mixed. In Uganda, we have amended our VAT Act to provide for equal treatment of supplies of educational materials from EAC partner states. These are classified as zero-rated supplies for VAT. So if you are a person in the business of educational materials, there is the opportunity. Import them from the other partner states, no VAT is imposed on it. We have exempted goods from partner states that have a valid product certification permit and notified product certification mark from this pre-inspection certification of conformity. Again, these are questions whether this is part of enabling trade, and the question then will be what is happening on the other side in Rwanda, Kenya, and Tanzania. I know Kenya keeps insisting on the conformity certification for even imports for rice and the like. Now, finally, there is something that happened last year, the restriction of export of Uganda poultry, especially eggs. The basis actually is a 25% excise duty that was in the Kenya excise duty law amendments. These were actually 2021. While everybody was locked up, Kenya was putting up tariffs. So when people were crying out about the eggs, I went and searched for and discovered that it was actually an amendment in 2021. But I can tell you a very interesting story. I traveled to Mombasa the tail end of 2019, just before COVID erupted. And while I was in the taxi cab, there was the taxi man was complaining about Ugandan eggs. That they were too cheap, they were making Kenyan businessmen have difficulty selling eggs when competing with Ugandan eggs. And I was thinking, what's the big deal? Even the taxi driver knows about our eggs and the issues of trade. So that's actually where the origins, and that was 2019. So you can see where it has come from. Now, it was the basis for close to about 11, it appeared on 11 parliament issue papers. Eventually, I don't think it was discussed. It kept appearing. This MP kept bringing this up as an issue that this needs to be addressed. Unfortunately, it sort of disappeared in there. Now, there's continuing efforts to grow an export-oriented economy. Free zones, there were 5 declared in 2022. I'm tracking what's happening in 2023. I know Ham Enterprises has been given a free zone. So I'm hoping that he will be able to pay his debtors, but he has been given a free zone recently, as of this month. Trade standards. Now, this is critical because it becomes the fulcrum of the basis for which trade, and has been the one which has caused big problems. Now, surprisingly, all the partner states, at least 4 of them, Uganda as well as Kenya, Tanzania, and Rwanda, are making standards very key to goods as trading products. As you can see, UNBS, through the National Standards Council, issued declarations of compulsory standards. They issued 2 of them last year, but they also issued, I think, a preliminary notice this year, but also issued additional notices again in 2022. And these relate to a wide range of products, including food, agriculture, chemicals, consumer goods, cosmetics. As I said, every partner state is doing this. So if you want standards, you need to look at those. There's a framework for importation of goods requiring goods to meet compulsory standard specifications declared by the UNBS. So this is critical. If you're importing goods, they must meet those standards. Bear a digital conformity mark, and then subject to the pre-inspection, verification, certification of conformity, except for those manufactured in the EAC partner states. Now, this all looks good, but usually the problem that comes up is these are standards that are specific to each EAC partner state. And often what the outcry elsewhere is that we're being subjected to standards that are elsewhere. I know Ugandans have had that problem. They take drugs to Kenya and they're told, no, they don't meet Kenyan standards. And I think there are those issues. Anyway, now, I know there's an uproar now currently in South Sudan over the maize and all that is in is now held by the customs officers in South Sudan. I've looked at the letters. They say they don't meet the standards issued by the National Standard Bureau of South Sudan. They claim it has a whole batch of toxins and all that, but that's not new. Kenya, I was shocked. I keep seeing Kenya issuing import. They seem to import huge tons and tons of maize, but one of the things they do is to require that those grains meet and conform with Kenya standards. So those are now critical questions for us that we're still using standards. Now, what's interesting is that the standards remain, and the partner states issue regular notifications or declarations. I think this year Rwanda has issued, in the half year, has issued like 3 of them. Now, what is critical is that as you go through these standards, there is emerging usage of what is called the East African standards. So you'll see them marked EAS. Now, whether that will be is part of the harmonization process, whether that is something gradual where eventually you can't dispute a particular standard. Because I notice in the issue that is coming up from South Sudan is saying that the maize doesn't meet the EAS standard. So they're not saying South Sudan standard. So the question is there an EAS standard on some of these agricultural products? Now, as I said, we still have Uganda standards, Kenya standards, Rwanda standards, but there's a growing move towards the EAS standards, which is good because that's towards now the harmonization. But I think for now, I think the drive would be how do partner states continue to recognize standards that have already been, each partner state standards, especially if these have been cleared by a standards body. Now, finally, there's a lot to digest in these 15 months that we have done. I've just presented Uganda. There are other partner states who have been doing their own thing. Now, as last one pointed out, the next scan will be from April to March 2024. But one of the things I'm discovering is that some of the laws that came out in the first quarter of 2023, we might sometimes even have to look at them, especially when we're looking at Burundi. Burundi has issued a number of unique instruments out of the first quarter of 2023. They're in French, so I might have to learn how to read French or get someone to read them. But don't worry, we'll give you in the next scan at least an English version or take content of what the French texts are speaking to. So we'll include Burundi in the next scan, so at least we'll have 6 partner states. But also one of the things we'll be trying to do is to see if we can look into the impact or implications of some of the regulations. Like I know that in Kenya, they issued what they call a Digital Credit Providers Regulations, the DCPs. And in the 4 months between November and March this year, they licensed 32 of them. So you can imagine that digital credit is a big thing. But of course, digital credit as well, that's what you get when someone tells you, on your smartphone that I can lend you. I've seen those pop-ups. That's the digital credit. Now it needs to be regulated. In Kenya, it was not regulated for a long time. Now it's being regulated. Now the question is, what's the uptake? Now all these are regulations which came at the tail end of 2022. So we'll be looking at opportunities of seeing what are the impact. If a regulation has been put in place, for instance, the CMA, Capital Markets Authority's new instruments on commercial paper, how many companies are picking up commercial paper? How many businesses? Is there an uptake of commercial paper? Or, as I always joke, people don't trust Ugandan businesses to pay back. Then we'll also be looking at tracking legislative processes. We tried doing that last year, but we said let's concentrate on past legislation. But one now even to look at what's happening in parliaments. I know we like talking about free zones and the export processing zones. They look very attractive, but I know that the Kenyan MPs have asked for an inquiry into how effective the export processing zones have been in Kenya in creating an export-oriented economy and creating employment. So we'll be looking at what's happening in parliaments so that we inform the kind of thinking that our representatives ahead of enacting legislation or proposing legislation are thinking about. So that's a quick overview of the CSG scan in as far as Uganda is concerned, drawing also examples of what is happening elsewhere. Thank you.
Kindly join me to give Dr. Nori another hand of applause. Thank you so much, Doctor. So that has been a summary of what the bigger scan that will be shared on the emails, because it's a very big document spanning work for over a year, and that is good. We picked up your email contacts and we'll be sharing that with the team. Thank you so much, Dr. Henry Michaels Honoria. We want to get to our panel discussion, and because this is private sector led, I want to invite my colleague Judith Aboto, who is going to be taking us through the panel discussion on how to make the common market protocol work. Judith, you're most welcome.
Thank you so much, Laston. As introduced, I am Aboto Judith Marianne, a lead associate at ALP East Africa, attached to the Infrastructure, Business and Energy Department. So today I'm going to be the moderator for this session concerning the key takeaways of the EAC Common Market CSG Scan 2022 to 2023. So at ALP East Africa, we have a number of clients that take part in international trade within the region. So with our experience in providing services to them, we realized that it was imperative for us to foster a discussion concerning the Common Market Protocol based on their experience in dealing or trading within the region. And that is why we're going to have this discussion today. We have a select panel of panelists today morning that I'll be inviting to join me on the stage. And we are going to have a discourse on the Common Market Protocol and the practices within the private sector, development partners, and the public sector. So without further ado, I would like to invite the first panelist for today, who is Ms. Jocelyn Kateba, who is the Managing Director of Crestform Limited, and also serves on different boards like NCBA and the Uganda Export Promotion Board. She's also a director at Uganda Manufacturers Association. Thank you. The next panelist I would like to invite is Mr. Andrew Gasira. Now, Mr. Andrew Gasira is a revered and seasoned entrepreneur in the Ugandan space, but also in the African space. He pioneered the retail presence of good African coffee in new frontier markets and opened possibilities for other value-added agro-exports. He is well known for not just good African coffee, but very many brands that he has built from scratch, and they have taken on and evolved a presence over and above what anyone would have imagined or expected. My next panelist that I would like to invite is Miss Angela Namboze, who is the country director of Trademark Africa. In Rwanda, we worked with the country director, Trademark Africa, and we're privileged to work with the country director of Trademark Africa in Uganda and South Sudan. And she has over 18 years of experience as an international development professional. We are certain that her presence on this panel is going to be of much, much impact. Last but not least is the final panelist, who is Mr. Emmanuel Sebi Josemanda, who specializes in the law of regional organizations, particularly East African Community, AFCTA, and EU law. He's also the executive director at the African Institute of Regional Integration Studies, which is a think tank on regional integration processes in Africa. So basing on his expertise, we are going to have this discourse today morning and find out what more we can do as an East African community. Thank you so much, my panelists, for joining me on stage. And without further ado, we will start with the private sector. So I think I'll start with Jocelyn. As a member of the private sector, this common market is private sector led. So as a member of the private sector and also a board member of the Uganda Export Promotion Board, do you think that the private sector has been integrated in the processes of making the common market protocol work? What has it done? Has it taken part in its processes?
Good morning, and thank you very much for having me and inviting me to participate on this panel. But just as a correction, I actually no longer sit on the Uganda Export Promotion Board. I did for a couple of years. I currently sit on the Uganda Manufacturers Association Board. In terms of participation, I'll speak from the perspective of manufacturers. We do have actually quite a lot of engagements, because we do have representation from the association that sit on both the Export Promotion Board, actually also Capital Markets Authority, as well as UNBS, so the Bureau of Standards. And we've been very active in policy engagements. We've been invited, at several engagements to inform a lot of those policies as they come to fruition. So I will talk to the one that is more recent for me and specifically to do with UNBS. There's been a lot of effort specifically around the harmonization of standards. And I think the whole effort there is to just make sure that once you have that certification that is recognized across the countries that are in the community, then you have better movement of product. The challenge that we have experienced, however, is the speed, at which we're moving. So when I look at the farm sector where I belong, we started these engagements a couple of years ago, and sometimes we drop off, then we come back to it, then we drop off again. So I think the frustration from our side is speed. How quickly do we move? And then the second one, obviously, that keeps us up at night is enforcement. I think it's one thing to have something in writing, and then it's another thing for it to be enforced. So I guess the point here is there is engagement, there are discussions, but when it comes to actually the effect aspect, I think that's where the frustration really lies. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Jocelyn. That has made me want to pick Mr. Semanda's brain on what's the key balancing act for the harmonization of standards within the East African community among the different states, and the states want or need to protect their citizens with regard to businesses and economy.
Okay, thank you. I think the starting point is that the private sector needs to take this initiative to actually litigate and enforce these common market rights on their own. I don't think that states are going to be so committed to harmonizing. I don't think that parliamentarians are going to be concerned with harmonization every day because they have so much other work to do. But the private sector needs to enforce their rights, both against themselves and against the partner states. Because if you look at it from the general legislative framework, if I may go theoretical, first and foremost, we have the ESC Treaty and the ESC Common Market Protocol. These are very comprehensive documents that are legally binding on all the partner states, all the 7 partner states of the East African Community. These documents have been legislatively received by all the parliaments of the East African Community, maybe with the exception of the DRC, which has just joined. But we have national acts of parliament that actually incorporate the ESC Treaty and the ESC Common Market Protocol. So these are actual laws in all our countries. We don't just have a treaty sitting in Arusha or being stored in an office in Arusha. We have a treaty that is law in all of our countries. Uganda, for example, has the ESC Act of 2002. That act specifically and fully incorporates the ESC Treaty and its protocols and gives Ugandans and the private sector in Uganda the right to actually claim benefits from this treaty. Also, our courts of law have accepted the application of this treaty and the protocol. None of our courts in all the partner states has said that ESC law or the ESC treaty is not applicable. Actually, courts have accepted that ESC law takes precedence over conflicting national law. So when we have the Common Market Protocol and it's giving us specific rights, then all national laws that are conflicting with that protocol should take are subsidiary, essentially, to the Common Market Protocol. And the 2 important doctrines that can help the private sector is the doctrine of precedence of community law, which I've just spoken about, but secondly, the doctrine of direct effect, which is that ESC law can be invoked by private individuals in the national courts. Many people have the perception that that you have to go to Arusha, to the East African Court of Justice, to litigate on ESC law. But all rights that arise from the ESC Common Market Protocol can be enforced by private individuals before their national courts. So I would say that rather than harmonization, we should be looking at integration by litigation, which is a model that has been adopted also in the European Union. These documents are always going to sit in the offices of civil servants unless they are litigated, unless individuals come and say, I have this right, and the court points a finger at the civil servant and says, you must do this because the law says this. Otherwise, just like constitutional rights, which were always on paper until they were actively litigated by civil rights activists and individuals, we will not realize integration unless courts of law are actually moved by individuals to implement the ESC Treaty. And lastly, on this point, these rights are not only held by individuals against states, they are also held by individuals against fellow individuals. It's the unique nature of ESC law and of integration law. So when we have banks, for example, charging us international fees for transacting across the East African Community, when we have universities charging international students from the East African Community as though they were international students, when we have domestic legislation that prohibits East Africans from incorporating their companies as though they were locals in each state, those are breaches that can be resolved by individuals even when they have taken on individual entities or individuals themselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. What I pick from what you're stating is that individuals, mostly members of the private sector, ought to be more proactive by enforcing whatever provisions or commitments have been made by the partner states in the EAC Common Market Protocol by going to court.
That's right.
Yes. So now this leads me to Mr. Andrew Garcia. So basing on what Emmanuel has stated, that members of the private sector ought to be more proactive and going to court to enforce the implementation of the commitments under the Common Market Protocol. In your experience or perspective as a seasoned entrepreneur, would you take this route, or have there been challenges that you have addressed in a different manner that has yielded fruit?
Thank you. I first want to appreciate Francis and your team for the work that you have done. I think it's very important to scan the environment, and many of us know, even in business, before you engage in an activity, you need to really scan the regulatory legal framework in order to build the ideas and the concepts that you have. So congratulations to you and your team. And thank you for inviting a good cross-section of leaders who are actually critical in implementing some of these considerations that are being discussed. Now, I just had a couple of thoughts, and I'm sorry, Judy, if I might not answer your question directly, because I thought it's important to speak to some of the results of the scan. And I had kind of two thoughts. One is, when you look at the reality of East African community trade, the outcome of activities of entrepreneurs and traders in this context, what is that outcome? The outcome is that intra-East African trade is very low, right? It represents a small fraction of global trade, about 0.5%. Intra-East African trade represents probably 18% of imports and probably 7% of exports. So it's very low. We have good laws, we have good legal compliance frameworks, but the activity, the business activities, are not as significant as would have hoped for. So there is a need, I think, of a convergence as to what is needed with what is actually being done, what is a reality on the ground. And sometimes we need to push for coherence with policies and economic realities on the ground. Now, there are some structural challenges here. One, if we are to take advantage of the East African as a trade community, we need to diversify our manufacturing and value addition significantly. Number two, we need to address the market failures. You can have good frameworks for movement of capital, but if there are market failures in entrepreneurs accessing capital, there's a problem. They'll not be able to set up the factories, they'll not be able to trade, they'll not be able to take advantage of this 280 million consumer population that we have in the region. And those structural issues, I think, really need to be addressed. And they also need to be addressed from the point of view as to what is the political will. Many of you have read the headline today about the refinery, right? How many of you have read that headline about the refinery deal that hasn't gone through? It's illogical that that can be a problem. Uganda consumes every year about 38,000 barrels per day worth of petroleum products, okay? Every year. The capacity that Uganda would need the refinery to produce to meet its demands would be 38,000. East Africa as a community demands 300,000 barrels per day of petroleum products, $5 billion a year, okay? How can we be having a problem with a failure of a project of that nature? $5 billion represents 25% of imports into the region, and we're having a failure of a refinery project? There must be something wrong with that story. Because if there is political will, I think we can address some of the fundamental structural infrastructure projects that can boost our trade and get us not just growing in GDP, but also creating jobs and creating transformation. And there's a good example. In the Far East of South Asia, there's what they call the Mekong Valley Delta, okay? It's near the valley, the Mekong Valley. That is South China, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Burma. Those countries got together and determined that they would create not just a policy framework, but the business environment to be the lowest cost producer of many of the manufactured goods that Europe consumes. So they built the infrastructure, they created business climate interventions, they created the incentives, and all that was needed for that region with those countries to be competitive on the global market. Now remember, Cambodia came out of a war. By the time the current President Hun Sen became leader, I think there were only 12 graduates from the university. The Kamaruja destroyed a lot of the intelligentsia. But today, Cambodia exports 8 million bicycles to the European Union because there's deliberate legal compliance, economic, political infrastructure and environment, but there's also the political will to determine to do things that are necessary to get the business going and boost these economies. These legal frameworks and compliance frameworks are good, but what is the political will behind them that is necessary to boost trade, to boost manufacturing, to diversify value addition, to create jobs for our people, and to get the economies going as they could and should do? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Regasira.
Sorry, I don't know if I didn't answer your question.
You've actually answered it in the other way. You've used, I think, a wise man's approach to it, in that you don't necessarily have to go through litigation. You have to foster political will for implementation of whatever commitments have been made under the Common Market Protocol. Yes. So I would like then to proceed to Ms. Angela Namboze. As an international development professional working with Trademark Africa that works with both the private sector and the public sector, and in line with the issue of political will and the public sector actually being in charge of implementation of these commitments, what has been your experience dealing with the private sector and public sector? Are they on the same board, going towards the same agenda of economic integration, or they are at different wavelengths?
Thank you very much. Like correction, my name is Anna Namboze, not Angela, but it's okay. I just want to add my voice to appreciate ALP for the initiative taken. It takes a lot of work to make the analysis done at this level, but it's also very important analysis, again, to be able to translate what has happened at the ESC into what needs to be done on the country levels, and to be able to measure them and see where we're going in terms of progress on a yearly basis. So it's a very welcome initiative. I see concerned stakeholders, the Ministry of Trade, among others, are here. So again, we're talking to the right people. So I think you can already see that the private sector and the government sector are already working together. To give our experience as Trademark Africa, we have been in this space since 2010. And the Common Market Protocol has really been a good driving force for the work we do, which is to facilitate trade. Through this protocol, we have been able to push a lot of the policies and actually implement a lot of the policies from the ESC level down among the countries. You'll see as far back having the single customs territory for the East African countries already has made a lot of savings for traders, because as soon as you get into the East African space, either at Mombasa or at Dar es Salaam, you're making your payments once, and then you're being able to transport the goods throughout East Africa. This made us savings for traders from about $3,000 for either the Northern Corridor or Central Corridor to $1,000. It makes things simpler. a lot of our other initiatives have been in terms of infrastructure to allow market access. And again, the one-stop border posts that we have in Busia, Mutukula, Mirama Hills, Goli, in Toroko have been made possible by, again, policies, the OSBP policies at the East African level that have been translated and then, again, implemented by the different countries, having both governments and the private sector work together. If the governments did not have the will to allow the revenue authorities to, of Uganda to be able to clear goods from Kenya, this wouldn't have been possible. But it is possible. With a lot of leverage and a lot of understanding, there is a will. Maybe to go again, we've talked about non-tariff barriers here. And Trademark Africa facilitated the Ministry of Trade with non-tariff barrier committees, the NTB committees that were established. We even went ahead to facilitate a system, the reporting system, where you could use an SMS to be able to report and say, you've been stuck or hit by a certain snag from a different locality, and then you'd be able to have somebody from the ministry immediately be able to respond to you. Now, of course, the problem is, again, with government priorities sometimes fall a bit lower than we would like to see, because once we handed over this NTB reporting system to government, after it had been piloted for a while, after about a year, then UCC fees are hit, and then the Ministry of Trade does not have the fees to pay the UCC, and since then the NTB reporting system has been quiet. Now, this is something that is very pertinent because, especially in the wake of what we've just seen with South Sudan, where it refused certain trucks carrying Ugandan grain and flour the last month, and then impounding them. Maybe if this system was working, we could have gotten real-time knowledge from the truck drivers on what was happening. Okay, I was actually in Elegu at the border of Uganda, South Sudan, within the week that the impounding started, but I only got to know about it about a week later. So, of course, this and trying to then mitigate and work with the Private Sector Foundation, Ministry of East African Community Affairs, Ministry of Trade, Uganda National Bureau of Standards, we have been, trying to see how to sort this out. Of course, it turned out, as you'll see, having a policy and practice not the same. It was actually the standards body in South Sudan did not know about it. The Ministry of East African Affairs did not know about it. It wasn't really an official sort of task or embargo that had happened. It's something that is more political than that. So again, we're still working with the different forces, and PSF is leveraging His Excellency's office to be able to sort that out. But there is a will and there is a way. I've had the talk about standards here, and we could go via litigation, but I think a lot of the legal fraternity here will also talk about the fact that litigation is not always the answer. We're trying to move away from that. And some of these are actually real. We could say, as a country or as Ugandans, are you willing to take substandard goods? Because we need to harmonize. So if a country, if there are little things like moisture standards, if Kenya wants 3%, Tanzania wants 2.5%, that is something we should be able to talk about and reach a certain standard that is safe for everybody, as opposed to waiting for the aftermath. And litigation will take years. So I think it's better to harmonize. Again, standards are very detailed, so every little thing has so many standards, but especially to improve the trade that we have within East Africa, the grain trade, the staples trade, food security, because Uganda can be a food basket. Standards harmonization would be key, and I think it's one of those things that we should really push to have as many standards harmonized as possible. I'll stop here for now.
Thank you so much, Anna. What I have picked from your discussion is that yes, there is harmonization and more work needs to be done towards that, but still both the private sector and the public sector must work towards it. So Jocelyn, as a member of the private sector, what you've mentioned the challenges that the private sector is facing, but what more should the private sector in its own right do to make the common market protocol work?
Probably I will start by saying, where some of the successes are already. And what I have observed, of course, when you look at I think, and you probably know this more than some of us. I know that Andrew talked about the intra-trade not being where it needs to be, but actually I think it clocked about 10 billion in September of 2022. Obviously still a fraction of what, the opportunity really can be. There is definitely some really strong success stories, where you hear about steel products using Lake Victoria, accessing Mwanza and really going through, a big portion of the Tanzanian corridor, especially the northern part. So when you pay attention to where the success has come through and therefore where the opportunities would lie, the first thing is going back to the infrastructure side. You need enablements, right? You need to have an enabled community to actually harness the opportunities. And so the first one is, the transportation corridors have to be developed, right? And then the private sector can take advantage, because some of the challenges we have is just moving product. So I talked about moving it on Lake Victoria, but the capacity is probably still lacking. For it to actually, if everyone who is manufacturing or producing here wanted to target Mwanza, I don't know that the capacity is there with what is actually on Lake Victoria today to actually accommodate it. So before we talk about what private sector should do, I think there's also some work on the public sector. Andrew did mention around capital. I'll give a story. I think it was back in 2019. The factory that I managed, we were lacking some textile. We knew the lead time that it would take for us to get the textile in from Asia, where we normally source. So we started looking at locally, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, who could give us the quantity that we needed. So of course we started with Uganda, it's the closest, but the capacity wasn't there. So we looked and finally found someone in Tanzania. But if I tell you, at the same time we were placing that order, we placed an order in Asia. By the time we received the textile consignment from Tanzania, it arrived at the same time as the one that we placed in Asia, which was about 2 months, Yeah, and so when we really tried to unpack what was really going on there, we found that the player in Tanzania didn't have the working capital to support the stock that they needed to enable them to address the demand that was possible in the region. So, sometimes it's even a case of, in our case, we went to find them. They hadn't even come to look for us. So some of us in the private sector also have to do some homework, understanding the market, understanding the needs, understanding what the capacity, conversation needs to be, and then actually going back into our spaces and saying, okay, what do we need to do to position ourselves? So there were two lessons there. The first one was the capacity just isn't there. And then the second one, obviously, the infrastructure. So this player was in Tanzania. The other challenge they had, of course, coming through TZ, I don't know if you've driven in Tanzania, and the speed limits, that has a real impact on getting product from Dar es Salaam to Uganda. It's over almost 2,000 kilometers, even just to Mwanza, right? So for us, I think the private sector, we need support. The cost of borrowing, continues to be prohibitive. Of course, there's been a lot of work done. We talked about on the capital markets, all these other instruments that are coming through. Exciting. Does it go far enough? Probably not. The reality is, in order for us to position ourselves to get where we need to, there is still a lot of support that we shall need from the public sector that we can't shy away from. If the cost of borrowing is still exorbitantly high, then how can I ramp up capacity? If the infrastructure issues are not dealt with, how do I really move product? So, some of these things are so intertwined that it makes it really hard, I think, to actually, you can see the opportunity, you can almost feel it, but you can't quite go after it. Okay.
Yes, thank you so much, Jocelyn. It takes joint effort to be able to realize what we want to achieve at the end of economic integration. So I would like each of the members of this panel to just give me what's one key takeaway at the end of this day, if we're to leave something that stood out for you from the capital services and goods scan. It could be in the movement of capital, it could be in the movement of goods or services, or what the scan hopes to achieve, which is regional economic integration and workings under the Common Market Protocol. So I'll start with you, Emmanuel.
Okay, thank you. I think the SCAN has done very well in terms of updating us on the legislation that's cropping up all over the region on how we can domestically improve, investments in capital, investments in services, and maybe even to take up more goods, and also, of course, how those can cross borders more effectively. And it has highlighted the restrictions to the recognition or to the realization of those freedoms for the movement of capital, for the movement of services, and for the movement of goods. But most importantly for me, on this notion of harmonization, we have three categories of harmonization. One is country-to-country harmonization, where the partner states discuss between each other that let us do this if you do that. Two, we have harmonization by the community instruments, which is a community legislation that sets minimum standards below which no one can go. And each state then determines within its discretion on how to implement those. The country-to-country harmonization takes a bit of a while. There are many discussions. As you know, ministers come, civil servants come, they go back, report to their political heads, etc. The conversation usually never ends. Harmonization at the regional level, we've seen it. The council passing regulations, for example, on mergers and acquisitions, and with a timeline of their implementation. But we don't see partner states implementing those. So once again, that brings us back to litigation. We have harmonization by mutual recognition, which is that we shall recognize each other's standards as equal to ours. So although Kenya may want the color red, Uganda may want the color green for their apples, but both countries recognize that, mutually recognize that those standards are okay. So for me, the takeaway I would highlight here is for lawyers to think about advising their clients about the alternative to harmonization, which is, let's not wait for politicians or for entities, civil service entities to talk. Let us, as lawyers, also advise our clients that they can enforce their rights and bring about integration a bit faster. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. Anna?
Thank you very much. I hope we're not asking too much if we ask ALP to see how we're going to link the SCAN to actually influencing policy. It would be a job that requires follow-up. They probably have to work with a lot of other, committees within the different ministries that are responsible. Again, so that is not just another document that is here. It is an excellent document, but it's see how do we translate so that we can actually influence the policy so that in the next year, instead of just reporting what has been done, again, we have a level of influence that has been created through the SCAN. I'm very excited that now we have a special economic zone policy at the ESC level, which will probably be captured next year. But again, as a country, because all we have is industrial zone and free zones, what can we do? I know Dr. Henry said in Kenya, they're trying to see what is the impact of these zones to our country, but I think I would like to see Uganda have, spread out, have ICT parks, have other kinds of zones with a lot of benefits for, people produce both for local and for export. But again, I think it's really implementation. I think the SCAN is an excellent idea, but let's see how we can translate it and have some results on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have taken that as a challenge, and we will come back next year having worked on that challenge.
I was trying to hide my notes here. I think Anne was reading them. So I'll hide them in the head. I want to piggyback on what she said, because I think mindset change is, I think, a critical issue, and that's really the challenge, Francis and the team. I have a small diagnostic company, and during the COVID pandemic, I really felt sorry for the business people who wanted to travel, like Sam and Stephen. You'd poke them here, do a PCR test here in Kampala. They get to Nairobi, they have to do another PCR test. God forbid they have to go to Mwanza or Arusha, they get another PCR test. Guys were being poked left, right, and center. But the PCR test is one standard. You don't need to have a PCR test in Uganda, in Kenya, in Tanzania. An East African community that can't harmonize a PCR test for COVID. We fought and lobbied, and it took almost 9 months, a second lockdown, until everybody said, okay, let's have a harmonized PCR test reporting system. And by the time we agreed on that, His Excellency lifted the lockdowns. But it's really an interesting story about how the mind of those who not only conceive and implement the policies needs to shift and to align to the economic realities and what is necessary. There needs to be a coherence between the policy and the economic realities on the ground to accomplish the objective for all of us to economically transform and develop our communities. Thank you.
I want to pick from a point that, Andrew, when you made your first submission, you talked about needs, right? So sometimes, you know, we need to give a voice, you know, to those of us who are actually living this, those of us who have put in quite a lot of investments and assets that are actually currently underutilized. You know, when we talk about in some sectors, you know, there's some, it's actually a mixed bag. There's some areas where you have, you know, full capacity utilization, but there are many places within, you know, the private sector where there is underutilization of assets. So my ask, I think, and probably what, you know, we could do together from the UMA side, this is the Manufacturers Association, and LP, is really understanding from the side of the practitioners, the players that are actually producing goods. You know, what is our experience? We need to unpack that a little bit more, much more than what you see in the papers, because what you see in the papers is some of it. But like the one I shared with you, you know, you might miss some of that. So can we have some sort of a study that sort of talks to, you know, what our experience is, what are the needs, where are we failing to move this 10 billion to represent actually 50% of the actual trade that's within the region? What is it? What's happening on the ground that are the barriers that we're really experiencing, and where can we then have probably more focus so that we can actually have effective policy formulation? Because sometimes, you know, policies are there, they're on some assertions, but are they really talking to the real pain points? And I think some of them are, but, you know, are we missing anything? So perhaps if we can have in the next scan a study, just like Anna said, more collaboration, so a study that sort of, you know, gets us in the room and really gets that experience unpacked, I think that would be also an interesting place for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. From this discussion and this discourse that we've had, what has been resounding is that there is need for joint effort, that to realize economic integration and the commitments that have been made under the Common Market Protocol, it's not only going to be only private sector, only manufacturers, or only the government or public sector working, but it needs for all parties involved to sit down, understand their needs, build capacity, and provide solutions to the existing challenges. A round of applause for these panelists. Thank you so much. I would like to release you. I see that Andrew wants to run. I would like to release you all to join the audience. Thank you.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, join me to give our panelists another round of applause. Those have been very great takeaways. Mr. Emma Sebijo, Enforce Your Rights Under the Community Instruments. From Miss Jocelyn Kateba, Unpack the Experience, make a study that talks about our experience and have more collaborations. Mindset Change from Mr. Rugasira and from Miss Anna Nambozo. Link the scan to influence policy. Without any further ado, I want to take this privilege to invite our team leader, Mr. Francis Gimara, who is going to be giving us his remarks. Mr. Gimara, you're most welcome.
Our guest this morning, the Honorable Minister of Justice and Constitutional Affairs, guest of honor, the Honorable Norbert Mao, you're welcome. My remarks are very brief because we wanted to keep this very short. We started late because the traffic was bad, but we want to honor our commitment to keep this neat and short because we are just beginning a conversation. LP has done this to initiate a conversation on how we can make the common market work, because it is not contested that the benefits are immense. and it's also not contested that the partner states have made commitments. If you've made commitments in treaty and protocols, what remains is enforcement. So what we've been discussing here are the challenges of enforcement of these commitments. You agree with me that conversation can only start and continue. So we'll continue. This morning, I want to just thank you to all of you for coming. Now, we've not attempted to introduce each one of you in your capacity, but for the entire audience, please take note that whoever is seated near you is a heavyweight in his sector. There is no lightweight in the room. So I'm not going to introduce each one of you because it will require me to introduce every person on the table, and we don't have that time. But thank you for coming. Thank you so much for coming. At LP, we think we have the credibility to lead this conversation because we have done some work for the ESC community. We have consulted for them. Some of the opinions we have rendered to them have been validated by the East African Court of Justice. We have also litigated on these matters. In fact, I think we have done the most litigation at ESCJ, and we are the first team to stretch the damages benchmark of that court to beyond $1 million. But we also recognize that litigation is not everything. We have to come to spaces where we can get conversations going. And I want to thank the members from the public sector who are there, ministry officials. We thank you for coming because it is important. We don't want the private sector to speak to themselves and the public sector to be alone. We want the two to always be in the same room so that we forge a consensus. So allow me, without further ado, to invite our guest of honor to make his remarks, and then he will launch this annual CSG scan. We will be back next year for another version because the compilation is ongoing. Again, thank you so much for coming. We don't take it for granted. We appreciate each one of you. Asante sana.
I want to thank ALP East Africa and the entire team. Dear friends, about 20 years ago, in 2003, I was suffering from burnout as a young MP, having gone to Parliament when I was just about to turn 29. So I went and hid in a small university in the state of Connecticut called Yale. And one day I was reflecting on globalization. And I sat at the dining table one winter in November and wrote an article, and I titled it from a phrase I picked from the Bible. The phrase was unevenly yoked. Those of you who use oxen to plow, you know that you should match the oxen according to their capacity to pull the plow. So when oxen are unevenly yoked, they cannot do much. Sometimes you find that the strong ox will have to pull both the plow and the weaker ox. This seems to be the state of the world in which we live. So the intention of our discussion here should be about leveling the playing field so that everybody can play. I'm pleased that I'm seeing amidst us people who have been thought leaders. Of course, Francis, my friend Francis Gimara, Senior Counsel, has been in the front line for a long time. And this conversation has got to continue because, as someone once said humorously, we live in a world of guided missiles and misguided leaders. We need to have leaders who are guided by clear thinking. The presentation by Dr. Henry Honoria, who I have known from as far back as I think 1986. And we were classmates in Namiliango College and later in the Faculty of Law, LDC, together in the same law firm. I think he has unpacked a difficult subject. This is a subject which is not easy. So I think the team at ALP is acting like a step-down transformer. A step-down transformer reduces the voltage of electricity so that it can be fit for purpose. If you want to charge a phone, it will give you the power you need. If you want to manufacture soap, it can also give you the power you need. It regulates. This is important, but more important is even for us to realize what is at stake. The future of our people is at stake. And I'm delighted by the variety of panelists. We have people who are there where the rubber meets the road. People who employ thousands of people. People whose livelihoods depend on whether Crest Form is open or not. We have people from Trademark. Trademark obviously has a lot of struggles to persuade leaders who have power, but as you know, power may not necessarily be a neighbor to wisdom. You may have wisdom without power, and you can have power without wisdom. Therefore, this conversation helps us to understand what needs to be done. My friend Andrew Rugasira has been there. You should read his book, A Good African Story. He is one of the greatest risk takers I know. And I believe he has the authenticity to talk about how things should be done and what needs to be avoided. Of course, Andrew has been spending too much time near lawyers. So now, instead of giving answers, he gives replies. Because lawyers don't give answers. When they're asked questions, they just say whatever they want to say. But I don't blame him. How can you survive when you have been spending too much time near lawyers? I head a service ministry. At the Ministry of Justice, we basically don't have any work of our own. All these documents you talk about, whether they are from which agency, we look at them and give our opinion. Some of the rules in Uganda are ridiculous because they actually delay business. For instance, one of the most ridiculous things is that every procurement whose value is 200 million and above requires approval from our ministry at the Attorney General's chambers. I see Ugandans carrying 200 million in a kavera. So this is what Professor Sejaka called bodanomics. He is the author of the famous word bodanomics. And which basically means bottom line approach to everything. You aim at the low, you aim low. That's what Bodanomics is about. I think we should advocate that that threshold should be raised at least to 500 million, because we cannot spend time. A public body wants to sign a contract worth 200 million, and you have to wait 2 weeks when victims of floods are dying, and you cannot procure maize because the Attorney General's chambers must first and foremost approve it. So these are some of the things that you have got to advocate for. And now turning to the subject, which I don't understand very well. Of course, I read Todaro in order to pass economics. I'm not an entrepreneur by any description. My only attempt at business ended up with a disaster. So I learned my lessons and I'm now sticking to what I know. It's important that we build this trade bloc because this capital, service, and goods movement is important. The contradictions you have raised here are not unique to East Africa. These contradictions exist in every trade bloc, whether it is ASEAN, whether it is the European Union. These contradictions exist. But life is about managing contradictions anyway. You manage the contradictions while sticking to the goal. The goal of our bloc here is to ensure that we are not too inward looking. I think the conversation today is largely about looking inwards at the bloc. Yet the purpose of the bloc is actually for us to look outward beyond East Africa so that we can attract capital, so that we can get affordable goods, and also transfer of knowledge so that we can have the best possible services. The verdict, therefore, as far as I'm concerned, listening to what I've listened to, is that our East African Community bloc is still under construction. I think the pillars are still shaky, and Andrew is polite, so he talks of lack of political will, but it is really stupidity. Yeah. I think stupidity of the political class is responsible. Let me give you an example. So Ugandans want to export cereals to South Sudan. Now, South Sudan, as you know, has many governments. There's the government that has the instruments of power, but then there are warlords. I don't know which group of warlords acting in the name of the government stopped our trucks. Then they decided that our cereals have toxins. I think they're called aflatoxins. Yes. So they invite a rival of Uganda for the South Sudan market to do the lab tests. They invite a Kenyan company. Now, your co-wife is the one determining. Okay, let's say your co-wife is the one carrying out DNA tests on your children. So the Kenyan company comes up with results and says, these cereals, not even animals should eat them. So our very own Minister Rebecca Kadaga protests and says, no, let us have an independent lab to do this. So a team arrives at the border and they are told, go home, we don't want you. The Kenyan test results are the ones that are valid. Now, if that's not stupidity, then what else is it? I don't think it is political will which is the problem. So, citizens have got a duty to demand leaders who are visionaries. For me, I have had my reservations about this kind of growing too fast of the East African community. And that is what being unevenly yoked actually means. We were good enough as Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania to start with. But even before we had consolidated that trinity, we now started bringing other people because we like to be Pan-Africanists. Perhaps the treaty should have thought about aspects of cooperation. For instance, Turkey has a relationship with the EU, but it does not have the full rack of benefits and rights with the European Union countries. In our case, I saw now Somalia is at the high table as soon to be a full member of the East African community. So I want to encourage a fearless debate about this because it is not about the future of those who are in power now. It's not about the future of the political leaders now. It's about the future of our children. Will they really have a foothold in this economy, in this world economy? We may end up with things which are comparable to the agreement signed between Mozambique and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, that each of the parties to the agreement will have the freedom to fish in each other's waters. Now, poor Mozambicans, they can't, will those canoes go to the Russian waters to do any fishing worth talking about? The Russians have giant trawlers and frigates that just came and crowded the entire coastline of Mozambique, taking the best fish. The Mozambicans didn't even send a rowing boat. But they had the agreement and they shook hands while... So this excitement about taking photos and putting signatures on every document thrown before us is a bit problematic. I'm not an enemy of free trade. I actually support free trade. So, I believe that it was visionary of the three presidents of Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. At that time, it was President Moi, President Mkapa, President Museveni, the three M's. They revived the East African community. Their act of courage was similar to the one of the leaders of Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, and at that time, West Germany, that signed that Treaty of Rome on April 25th, 1963. They made a good start. But, like I always say, there's a difference between growing and swelling. So has the East African community grown or has it just swollen? I leave you to decide, because growing is qualitative, swelling is just quantitative. So I think we may have swollen without growing. Finally, we look forward to proposals from you on what legal reforms we need. We'll be happy to invite you to our boardroom. At least at the Ministry of Justice, there's a new spirit of listening. I believe that a minister should act advisedly. There are hundreds of people who are paid at the Ministry of Justice to give me good advice. Therefore, there is no need for me to pretend that I know everything. We will welcome this so that we encourage our key decision makers, particularly at the level of the presidency, to act in the spirit of statesmanship. The CSG scan should also measure the extent to which the economies of the member states of the EAC have expanded and whether the expansion is attributable to the common market. We should be able to, the economies may be expanding, but it may not be actually attributable to the common market. So we should not have an inflated assessment of what the common market actually does. So it is up to you, the professors, like Professor Sejaka, to simplify these concepts. After all, even at the cooperative society level, that's also a trading block. If you have a cooperative society and you say you are Igara tea growers, you negotiate better when you are many. So you should simplify those principles so that people don't start thinking that this is such a complex thing that it requires a professor to understand it. Africans have been cooperating, and empire building has always gone hand in hand with trade. These were never just empires of politics, these were empires of markets. That is why empires were built alongside trade routes. And one of Africa's biggest problems is the nature of our coastline. We don't have many places where big ships can dock, unlike Europe, where you can almost dock anywhere. So it is important for you to explain those kind of things. You look at a town like Arua. Why does Arua boom? Because Arua has Congo next door, it has South Sudan next door. Gulu has 6 exits. All that it needs is now to have a serious ferry, or even perhaps a suspended bridge across the Nile to Moyo. Then you'll see what will happen. Lira had a lot of problems because it was being avoided for a long time. Because the comedian said that the Ministry of Works on the milestones always put Lira abbreviated as LRA. So people avoided going there thinking that the LRA is, but that abbreviation came before the LRA actually. But jokes aside, the subject matter of this gathering is pivotal to our survival as an economy. You must have something to sell which people desire, and you must be able to attract people to invest in your economy. So I was very honored that my friend Francis Gimara, Senior Counsel, invited me to be part of this conversation, as unqualified as I am on the subject. And it is not customary for politicians to admit ignorance, and even politicians, it is even, for lawyers, it is even worse. They will never admit ignorance. But from today, I promise I'm going to take time and study this subject. Next time you hear me on TV, I'll be talking as a convert to this new philosophy that you are pushing, that we should keep evaluating how we are doing. You cannot keep going somewhere and you do not know how you are doing. That's the difference between what they call speed and velocity. Velocity means your movement plus your direction. If you are on a treadmill, you only have speed, but you don't have velocity because you are not actually, your position is not changing. So this scan is critical. We may be thumping our chests, but in reality, we may actually be moving backwards. It's a painful thing that you are going to be bringers of bad news to us, the political class, but you are discharging your duty to make sure that we wake up to the challenges that face us. I'm therefore very pleased now to participate in this launch according to the directions of those in charge of the program.
Let us give a hand of applause to the Honorable Minister. And we are going to the gist of the launch itself. You'll allow me invite the members of the high table that are seated with the minister to join the minister. Professor Kauha, please, would you kindly also join us? You kindly also join us. And the panelists as well.
Please. You taught us without us having to pay tuition.
I'm informed each one of us is actually going to be getting a hard copy of this.
I'm told there is also a summary for politicians.
Dr. Noria Irene Namuli, please, would you kindly... It is also good as a young man to be part of this, so help me with the scan. Otherwise, I will only be on the microphone. I want to join this launch. So, Honorable Minister, we kindly welcome you to just launch. This is the full. There is the summary for the politicians indeed, but this is the full product.
You know, my pastor used to say even the Bible has what they call the backsliders edition, which you can quickly put in your pocket in case you are doing things which are not in line with the Bible. So I now have the honor, dear friends, to launch the annual CSG Scan 2022-2023 with appreciation to ALP East Africa for God and my country. Thank you.
So, let us give the Honorable Minister another hand of applause. So that was the last of our agenda. We still have breakfast for us as we interact and as we depart at leisure. Get a contact of a fellow player in the industry. Get a contact of a fellow player in the industry. You can pass by the registration desk and you get a copy of the scan. We have a copy for each one of us. And we still have some breakfast for you. We still have some breakfast for you for our colleagues that could have arrived late and they didn't have breakfast. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We wish you a lovely Tuesday. Have a lovely day and God bless you.